Hi, everyone. Good evening or good afternoon or good morning, wherever you might be in the world. Some familiar faces. Thank you all for joining us, particularly as it's a bit later here in Australia. So appreciate you all staying up. I know that it's probably been a long day of Zoom calls and meetings and work, and we're towards the end of the week as well before a long weekend. So really excited to be working with you all today. So thank you. And I know that it took a lot for all of you to be here. As Dan mentioned, my name is Ramon, and really just want to, I'll start probably sharing the screen a little bit. And before we get into it, it might be worth just explaining a little bit about my background. As Dan mentioned, I work with Alkimia Learning, and Alkimia really looks to help to design learning that matters and learning that can transform, and really working to help organizations and teams and individuals really connect with transformative learning experiences. Part of the work that we've done, as Dan mentioned, is partner with Kaospilot out in Denmark. And Kaospilot is a creative design school focused on leadership. And their flagship program, their enterprising leadership program, is a 3-year program that really is made to understand how do we create the leaders that we want to see in the world. So Kaospilot's mission is really to be the best school for the world, right? So how do we really think about creating those type of leaders? And I love the name Kaospilot because so much of what we're trying to do now is help folks and leaders really navigate the chaos that we see in the world around us. And so we're going to spend a little bit of time on what that means. We're going to talk about sort of why is it so hard for us to really kind of work within these systems at times. And then we're going to get into a real practical framework that you can really use for your own personal strategy. So we'll share my presentation. All right. Can you all see the screen? Yeah? All good? Great. And so the idea is, as I mentioned, our intention for today is really to explore these kind of systems that we inhabit, and a lot of times some of the blind spots that we have when interacting in these types of systems. And then thinking about what are some frameworks that can assist us in understanding and designing the type of world that we'd like to see emerge from all of this, right? So when we look at what's happening in the world around us, we're seeing the complexity and chaos really play out. So I'm originally from the Dominican Republic, but I grew up in New York. And to see what's happening across the United States, it's very clear that there is a real need to understand, well, how do we question a lot of the assumptions that we've been working under within the systems that we have, and understanding that some of those systems have clearly not worked for all of us. And so how do we really start questioning and leaning into allowing to what we want to emerge from this transition? And of course, here in Australia and around the world, we've been dealing with COVID-19 and the coronavirus pandemic. And so we're seeing now that we're moving into these new phases of the pandemic, and really understanding, well, what does this new reality, as people talk about, what would that look like? And what I'd like to explore is then how do we avoid maybe going back to that old reality? Because for a lot of reasons, clearly that was not working, right? And so how do we start questioning and testing some of the things that we'd like to see in the system? In terms of the agenda, like I said, we're just gonna do a quick kind of intro and then really get into the framework itself, as Dan mentioned, and thinking about the Cynefin framework. And then we're gonna get you into smaller groups, because again, we do have a very short period of time. So we're gonna make this go quickly, and then a quick checkout and thinking about what this means for you. In terms of how we wanna work together today, really important that you realize that that there is no one person that has the answer, right? So we want to do it in a way, I'm clearly not coming here as some expert around how to deal with complexity, but really a way to guide folks and give folks some tools that could potentially be helpful for the work that you're doing. But because of that, and because we have such a great diversity of folks in the crowd, really important that you make the connection back to your practice, right? So really important that you think about, how does this really work within the context that I'm operating from? And then we want to make sure that we have a safe space to explore and stretch and screw up, right? So really making sure that we have a chance to test out ideas and concepts with each of us as well. One thing that I'd love for you to reflect on is, what is a challenge or something that you're facing right now when it comes to this idea of complexity? What's a complex scenario that you're facing or that you're undertaking, right? So for a lot of us, it could be really filtered through the lens of this transition with COVID, or it could be a transition that you're making in your life, or it could be around developing a strategy for your business. So thinking about, what are some of those challenging or complex scenarios that you're facing, because we'll want to really talk through those later on in the session. And so to start us off, I'd want to really understand, well, how do we perceive ourselves inside our system? So what I want you to do really quickly is, if everyone can just get a pen, if you can find a pen or a pencil or anything that has a straight line, right? Cool, great. So what I want you to do first is to just point it up into the air, and very slowly you're going to be making circles in a clockwise fashion. So just really quickly, just make a circle. And then what I want you to do is to slowly bring this down to your level. Keep going in clockwise, and now to your chest. And if you look at the pen, what's happened? It's now going counterclockwise, right? And so what's interesting is again, super simple exercise, but I think a really powerful way to understand this idea of the way that we perceive systems and perspective. And that because of the fact that we can't sometimes understand our role and our position within the system, that makes it really hard for us to identify and separate ourselves out, right? And particularly when we think about these systems, we understand that from one perspective, it may be interpreted in a certain way. But once you find yourself from a different perspective, all of a sudden that system or that problem really changes. And so what's important is that we can't depend on our own perspective when it comes to working in systems. We have to depend on the perspectives of others as well. And then we want to do another quick activity. So I want you to just get a piece of paper, just a blank piece of paper. You just hold it up. Maybe you have some writing on it, that's fine. So if you could hold up that blank piece of paper, I'll just want you to ask you to then fold it in half. Okay, and then just gonna now fold it once again in half. And then fold it a third time. And then fold it one more time. Get that to a fourth fold. Okay, so hopefully you'll see where you're at. In terms of the thickness, I'm curious how thick your papers are. Okay, so I see all of you. So yeah, it's fairly thick. Now, my question to you is, if I were to ask you to fold this piece of paper 29 more times, how thick would that be? If I asked you to fold that 29 more times, how thick would that be? Do you think it would be maybe up to your chest here? I know it's hard, it would be physically maybe impossible to do. Somebody's saying higher, higher, higher. Any other guesses, maybe in the chat? How high would that be? If you folded this 29 times, maybe that high, that high. Let's see what some ideas in the chat. Let me just take a look at the chat. The moon. So not quite the moon, but it is, if you were to fold that piece of paper 29 times, it would be more than 29 times thicker than it is now, right? So it'd actually be the distance of about 5,000 kilometers, right? So that's also really interesting. So about 5,000 kilometers, if you were to fold this piece of paper 29 times, it would be the height of 5,000 kilometers. And that just goes to show also our inability to sometimes really grasp, you know, large numbers and this idea of exponential growth. And I know that exponential growth is something that we've been talking a lot about in the news. But really sometimes when you're put in that position, the complexity of a problem can really overwhelm potentially a lot of times with the way we think about it cognitively, right? And so that is another limitation that we have when we're working in complex systems. And then the other problem that we have is this problem of inattention, right? And so this idea of the missing gorilla, which I love, right? So this is a study that's been done multiple times, and it's basically taking radiologists, as you see there, and having them perform essentially a lung detection task, something that they are very well familiar with, right? These are people who are experts at detecting this in this scenario. Well, they've put a picture 48 times larger than the average nodule and inserted that picture in the last case. And as you see there, only 17% of the radiologists were able to see it, right? So what you see there then is this impact of our inattention. And a lot of times it's the very expertise that we have that creates blind spots in how we look at problems. And so while 83% of radiologists weren't able to see that, the idea is that because we have certain ways, mental models and frameworks of approaching problems, that creates serious blind spots for us. And so when we have that kind of inattention, that could be really important, particularly when we're in these kind of really complex and chaotic situations and scenarios, where now you want to find a way to listen to the signals, those weak signals that you're seeing across different parts of the system that can help identify impending issues, problems, or chaos that's coming down the road, right? So really important to understand, how do we then think about creating ways for us to really look at maybe that missing gorilla. And what we're finding is that, in fact, with coronavirus, it's not even a gorilla. A lot of people talk about this as being this black elephant, right? So we know this kind of the white elephant in the room concept, right? So a lot of times we know that folks been talking about a pandemic and the potential problems the pandemic could bring. But this kind of pandemic and at this scale and scope is something like a black swan event where nobody really could have predicted it. So in a lot of ways, this is that black elephant, something that has been talked about in the past, but nobody could have predicted the scale and scope of it and how it's come about and evolved over time. So it's important then, this concept that the map is not the territory really is a way to understand, you know, when we're working in these type of systems, we depend on maps to get around. And what we're understanding is that over time, those maps become potentially inadequate. And why is that? Why do maps become inadequate over time? If you want to put in your chat, maybe. Why do maps become inadequate over time or insufficient? The landscape changes, yeah. That's right. So again, things around us change, but then the map's not updated, right? New things are discovered, as was mentioned there, right? And so really important that we then start thinking, if we want to really move in this new territory that's emerging in our world right now, it requires us to really think differently about the types of maps that we're using. And so when we talk about complexity, and this is a nice example, right? So I lived in Brazil for a number of years and saw a lot of this, right? A lot of entanglement. And when we think about complexity, it feels like this bit of entangled problems that we deal with. So in your mind, what is complexity? What is complexity? What are the elements? What forms complex systems? What are some ideas if you want to put in the chat there? Yeah, so interdependence, right? And interconnectedness, as Claire mentioned. So there's definitely this sense that, again, there are pieces that come together that are interconnected and intertwined and interrelated. Dan mentioned an unknown space, right? So something that is unknown and really emergent for us, right? So that also over a period of time, these complex systems shift and change more than meets the eye, as Miriam mentioned, right? Non-linear flows. That's really, really important. So it doesn't have the same causal effect that we're used to, and too much to think about at once. So no one person can really grab a hold of their entire system. Tim also mentioned that they're unpredictable for sure, right? Hayden talks about multiple systems, people, and pieces. And Pia also mentions a lack of order, right? So clearly this idea of moving away from ordered systems to this kind of disorder. Unknown how things are related, fast speed of growth. Claire also mentions aliveness, right? So complexity also means that there's an inherent kind of vibrancy in these systems, right? And they are more morphic, right? They're almost like an amoeba that can potentially shift and change, and often siloed, as Pia mentioned. Banks are complex, yes. So dealing with banks can feel complex. So really some great points, right? So this is what we're trying to deal with. And I would really recommend, if we want to understand how we've gotten to this point, in terms of the complexity that we're seeing in the world, there's a great book by General Stanley McChrystal called Team of Teams that I would highly recommend. And in that, and so General Stanley McChrystal was the head of JSOP, the Joint Special Forces Operation Unit, that was working in Afghanistan at the time of the war in Afghanistan when it first started in 2004. And he really coined this idea of this VUCA world that we're living in, right? That's volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous. And what he's talked about is that because the terrain that we're facing in the military had changed, they needed to change their tactics, right? And so what we're finding is that that type of complexity is something that we're seeing in our lives all around us. So the rate and pace of change has increased. We're seeing that globalization has also made the systems that we're working in much more complex. And we're also finding that the technology and digitalization has really also sped up that kind of rate and pace of complexity. And so we're going to talk a little bit more about that. And so really curious for those of you, there's some of you I think that are familiar with Cynefin, and I just really want to go through that very quickly. And I want to get you though into breakout groups so that you can talk a little bit about some of those complex problems that you're dealing with. So Cynefin was developed by Dave Snowden. So he was one of the folks that helped to start the Agile movement. And it really stands for this aspect of habitat or place of multiple belongings. And the idea is that we as human beings then inhabit multiple places and spaces, and that we have multiple identities that we allow to emerge in all of these spaces. And so this Cynefin framework then becomes a really interesting way for us as leaders to then think about, well, what does this mean for us going forward and approaching problems, particularly because the kinds of problems that we face are so different, and they're different in scale and scope, and they're different in the level of complexity. And so somebody had mentioned this idea of ordered versus disordered systems, right? So what we find is that we are always in this kind of flux of order and disorder. And so Cynefin really helps us identify what scenario are we in, and it also gives us a really simple way and simple framework to respond, more importantly. So when we look at ordered systems, he talks a lot about those kind of first being obvious systems. So those obvious or simple systems are the ones that have really strong causal effect. So those are the ones where you will find very easily understand if you go follow steps A, B, and C, it will lead to D. So it's almost like following a recipe. If you follow the recipe as it stands, you will always get the same result. Now, for some of us, that might be different if we're starting to follow baking recipes. I know a lot of us are starting to bake, so maybe you're getting very different results when you follow your recipes. But essentially, in really obvious and simple systems, you should be able to follow the same steps and get the same results. And in those systems, Dave Snowden talks about the need to, first, you have to sense, then you have to categorize what the problem is, and then respond with the best practice. So one example could be driving a car, right? So for all of us who know how to drive, there's one best way to drive, right? So there, you can maybe question, should we drive on the left or the right? That is up for debate in a lot of countries. But really thinking about, those are the obviously generally accepted principles and ways of doing things, right? So that's one way to do that. Then we have this next order of ordered systems, which is complicated. And these complicated systems are now not just have these causal links, but they're actually a conglomerate and an amalgamation of different pieces working together. So going with the car, it's not just about thinking, how do we drive? It's actually looking at the car's engine. That's a complicated system. And so I don't know about you, but whenever a car breaks down, I go to the mechanic, right? So the idea is that here you want to go to an expert because they're going to be able to go in, diagnose what the problem is, sense, and then analyze and diagnose, and then respond with what's called the good practice, right? So that good practice is really what we want to do in order to solve those kinds of problems. And again, that's why we go to mechanics. That's why we go to doctors when we're sick. That's why we want lawyers. And that's why we bring in consultants to help with any business problems that we might have. So this realm of experts really also work with these kind of governing constraints that we're surrounded with. Now, as we move into disordered system, then we get into complex systems. And as you mentioned, those complex systems are much different than complicated systems because now you don't have that causal relationship. They're emergent, they're interconnected. You can't pull them apart and put them back together again. And so here, if we're trying to drive, it's essentially like trying to say, hey, let's try to figure out how to drive without the lights on. Then that becomes in Brazil traffic, that becomes a really complex endeavor, right? So complex systems are also massive living systems that we're in. So again, the Amazon rainforest is a great example of a massive complex system, or problems that we're trying to solve for as well, such as education, or trying to figure out the healthcare problem. So those are really massive, complex problems that we're facing. And then finally, we have chaotic scenarios. These are things that we've never seen before. And so for a lot of us, the early stages of the COVID-19 crisis really was chaotic. because we'd never seen that before. It'd never been experienced by anyone. There was no playbook. There was no way to go to an expert. There was no way to really understand what was happening. And so in those scenarios, the best thing to do is really to act first, then sense, and then respond. So really important that we act. And so taking COVID-19 as an example, the countries that did the best in responding to COVID-19 were the ones that acted really quickly and decisively in the face of that crisis, right? So again, really a different way to think about crisis response. And so you have the framework there. Really important to understand that when we're working in these different systems, there's real value in creating constraints, right? So in obvious or simple systems, we want fixed constraints. We want to understand what are the steps that we need to follow, right, in order to get the right outcome. And when we're working in those systems, we want those kind of fixed constraints. When we're working in complicated systems, we're looking for governing constraints. So these are constraints and principles that help us understand the accepted rules of the game, right? So if we can follow these rules of the game, then we'll ultimately get the result and the outcome that we're looking for. When we're working though in complexity, it requires enabling constraints. And so these enabling constraints really are very different. They allow us to understand what are the principles that are gonna, and heuristics and shortcuts that will help us bring about what we want to emerge. And then also allows us to do these what are called safe to fail experiments. And then finally, in chaotic system, there is no relationship, and then we do not have those constraints, right? So again, thinking about that role of constraints is really important to understand how we deal with different systems. And by enabling some of these constraints, you can actually change the order or disorder of certain systems, right? And so you can imagine if you've worked with, if you have children or been around children, you know, I have a niece and a nephew that are 2 and 4 years old, and really important, this idea of constraints. So when you create these kinds of constraints, that you create the boundaries under which kids can work under, right? And of course, when we're dealing with these kids, we need to use different constraints depending on the context, right? Really, really important. And so again, when we're dealing with different scenarios in our lives, the same thing applies. How do we think about those constraints that could potentially help us enable and really move forward when we're faced with a lot of uncertainty, when we're faced with something that potentially has unintended consequences, and that we're dealing with somebody that really there is no one solution. And so that's where we want to think about those kind of enabling constraints that can really help us in these scenarios. So these enabling constraints really are context sensitive, right? They force alignment between different agents in the system. They provide feedback back to those agents, and then that allows for this level of understanding and emergence that can happen, and moving us from lower ordered system to higher ordered systems. And when we're dealing with complex systems, it's really important then as well to take a moment to probe, right? To probe those systems, to really understand, as we talked about, how do we get different perspectives from folks? And one of the best ways to do that is to create these small, safe to fail experiments. So really that's the way that we know what's working and what's not working. That also helps us understand if something is working, how do we amplify that? How do we magnify that? And then looking for ways to then help to not necessarily solve the problem, but in certain ways help to evolve the problem, given that. So thinking about what are some ways that you can probe the complexity that you're facing? What are ways that you can ask questions? What are ways that you can get multiple perspectives? And then find ways to do these kind of safe to fail experiments that can give you more feedback that you might need going forward. And so I want to now understand from you, what's next for you? What are the implications for the work that you're doing given this framework? And then how can you change some of these constraints? What are some different ways that you can probe the system that you're working in? So what I want you to do now is if we can break out into smaller groups. So we have, you know, maybe we can get into a couple groups, Dan.
I'm all ready to go. Ramon, do you just tell me to hit the button, and I'll send everyone off to their breakout rooms.
Great. So we'll send you now into those breakout rooms. And right, welcome back, everyone. And hopefully you had some really good discussions in your breakout groups. Any just potential insights or nuggets that came out in some of the groups? I'd love to hear from a couple of folks.
I won't take the credit because I think it was Helen that actually said it, but she actually said that often complexity, it's actually often from the people. And I think that was a common theme that we had. It's the people that create that complexity or the chaos as well, as opposed to the systems or whatever else, the technology or whatever else that we use.
Yeah, it's a great point, Emma, right? So it's a lot of times the people, and we're just uncovering this. I think we know this almost intuitively, but the science is now just, you know, catching up in the last 30, 40 years when we think about behavioral psychology, behavioral economics. We don't act as rational agents in systems. We don't always look for act in our best interest, right? We're not consistent in different scenarios. So this for sure adds to the complexity. Any other insights or things that were talked about in your groups?
I think from the sounds of things, Helen's husband should have joined us in the session. I'm just looking at the chat comment, Ramon.
For sure. Yeah, and I was able to pop in a couple chats. I think this idea of what kind of intervention is needed in which kind of situation is one of the key things. And so this is what really becomes frustrating, because what we're seeing is that clearly there's sometimes you need, you know, simple and obvious solutions. You need the checklist. You need the thing that's gonna really get to the solution, and you need the system in place. And then other times you do need the ability to really probe and find ways. And so that's why agile ways of working are a really great way to probe the system, design thinking, appreciative inquiry. These are all really great methods that can help us probe the system. But sometimes those are not necessary. And so when we think about why agile hasn't worked in certain situations, organizations, or companies, or why design thinking feels like it's overused, it's because they've been used and misused in different contexts. So that's one thing to keep in mind. Any other insights, things that came up in your groups? Dimity.
I was just reflecting on a change. A company was going bankrupt, and it was sort of like this kind of chaos, and a very directive decision happened from the CEO, which was to kind of focus on bringing more respect into the organization and transforming the company, shifting leaders and so on based on how respectful they were. And it moved from sort of a chaotic to a kind of more complex system, and then became more ordered, I guess. And I was just reflecting on the power of constraints, the right constraints to create order and enable performance. And
Yeah. So that's a really great point too, right? So the power of constraints can help create order and shift the system, right? But the question is, what kind of constraints and when do you use them? Because if you try to create very fixed constraints when you're in a complex or chaotic system, that typically does not work, right? So what I find, which is super interesting, there was a company that as they're moving their people to a virtual environment, they said, all right, we're going to figure out how to make sure that you all have ergonomic furniture. That was like one of the highest priorities, ergonomic furniture. And they created protocols and systems around getting furniture. And it's like, well, actually, there are other things, other constraints that we need to think about that are much more important, which are the principles around how we're going to work together in this new environment. How are we going to make decisions? How are we going to collaborate? So those become really important to really navigate, so that, because there's not one answer, right? It has to be co-created in the system as well. So thinking about what are those type of constraints and what can you use to help shift the system from order to disorder. And so we're not saying that order or disorder is good. What you want to figure out is how do we balance between both, actually. And so I know that we're almost at the hour, and just really some final thoughts before we keep moving. Things that you can keep in mind. So as we move forward, really important that, one, this idea that we first breathe and check in with yourself throughout this complexity. So that's so important, right? This idea of being able to ground yourself first and foremost before you start thinking about what actions you're going to take is super important. Ground yourself and ground the people around you to make sure that you're checking in on the needs that you have and that other people around you have. Assess the type of system that you're working in, right? And understand what context that you're in. Involve more people, right? So this really works when you can get as many voices as possible and get them working in different ways, making sure that you create a collective vision so that, again, when you want to move in complexity, you don't necessarily know exactly the path, but you want to create a vision of what that future is going to be. And then start with first principles, thinking about how do you make sure that those principles that you're working with are co-created and agreed upon. And then reflect on those potential courses of action. So for me, using scenario planning in this case, right? We can't, you know, I work a lot with universities, and I think about the big five-year plans that universities have had. You know, those are out the door. And so really it's around how do we create vision and principles, and then thinking about what are some potential scenarios and paths, and then work from the system's strengths, really, really important. So thinking about what's emergent. You know, I gave the example of and I talked to Dan about this, Stage Kings, which is a super, super local example of a stage company that works with live events and concerts, and they needed to pivot, but they used the strength to pivot into creating furniture for people working in home offices. And they've sold something like 5,000 stand-up desks in 2 months. So think about what are the strengths in the system, making sure that you build feedback loops, and then highlight and recognize the behavior that you want to see. And so as we finish up, if you could just put in the chat, what is one thing that you want to do differently before we wrap up? And then I'll pass it over to Dan. Thank you so much.
Awesome. Thank you, Ramon, so much. Now, I was going to open the floor. We're actually on the hour. I was going to quickly open the floor to some questions, if you guys don't mind. I always go for 75 minutes because sometimes we float a little bit over the 60-minute mark. But I think this has been a really engaging session. I imagine it's opened up lots of questions. Guys, if you've got any questions, pop them in the chat now and we'll just quickly run through them.
Great. Let's stop sharing. Yeah, any questions that you might have?
Because I was just in the chat and I was just making a point of the complex systems and priorities. It's something that we're going through at More Space, and something that we were discussing with the people that we share office space with, about prioritizing a physical location, whether it's a vanity need or, you know, and how that affects the business model. I'm just looking, David has asked how to help an organization frame fail as good.
Yeah. So this is a big one, right? So I think one of the things that we find is that organizations it becomes really difficult for them to work in complexity, because failure is something that is framed as not good, right? You know, when you think about the opposite of success, we think of it as failure. and that's just not the case, right? So, and again, because ordered systems and organizations that want to create this order have created all the protocols and processes to make sure that there are outcomes that are not optimal based on that system. But we've optimized for that kind of efficiency. And so what we're finding is that if we want to do something different, it requires us doing different things. So it requires us taking on different approaches. And so one of the simple ways to think about reframing this for organizations, and I like this framework, by the way, where you can go to some of your stakeholders. So you can go to your clients, you can go to your bosses, you can go to your senior leaders, and really explain and take time to explain this framework, because it really helps for them to say, wow, we have a very complex and chaotic environment that we're in, but our organization is set up for obvious and simple, right? And that in and of itself helps people say, wow, we really need to shift. I did this with a bunch of HR leaders a few months ago, and this really blew their mind, because this is the kind of thing that could really help to reframe the conversation with the CEO and other people in the C-suite. The other thing that you can do is then, beyond reframe, is then helping them to really take small steps in the way you engage with people in your teams. So one of the things that really helps is to really start those small scale experiments just locally, so that, again, you can really take those small steps so that you can test and experiment with different aspects of this, so that all of a sudden you can really start very slowly reframing what failure looks like, and then turn failure into more of, well, how do we learn? And one of the things that I did with my organization, and Zingo is another company that I founded, we needed to make a massive pivot, and they were afraid of this idea of failure, because what Zingo does is we take and design these immersive experiences connecting university students to social innovation projects around the world. Well, you can't travel. So that meant we needed to pivot. And my team was sitting back and saying, well, what if we fail? We're potentially gonna run out of cash in the next few months. And so what I implored them to do is say, look, go out and really talk to folks, get a sense of what's happening. And then instead of saying we need to make a pivot immediately, how do we create these small scale experiments? And now we're moving into the virtual internship market, right? So we made this pivot, but in a very small way. And the idea is to test and to learn from that experience. So how do we create that? Again, reframe the leadership, the way the leadership thinks about the problem, but then act locally as well.
That's fantastic, Ramon. So something that I kind of picked up from some of the questions, and you did touch on a bit, was how do you, and we'll end with this question, but we talk about experiments and we talk about the actual doing and the local and starting small, but how do you actually get people in the room? Like, are there any kind of tips you have to actually frame the conversation in such a way that isn't so big and scary, and to onboard people just to have the conversation?
And so, and what do you mean? What scenario are you thinking there, Dan?
So say, for example, a big complex change conversation where you're going to be working differently, and in your mind, your intent as a facilitator or as a project lead or bringing someone in is to, as opposed to invest heavy on a bigger, longer project, but actually start to take a different approach that
Yep.
is more of quite a few small localized experiments.
That's
which
right.
Would ask for investment and ask to bring in resources maybe from other departments.
Yep.
When in the company's mind there might be bigger projects that are happening that, you know, that kind of fill the needs of business as usual and day to day. How do you reframe and get the right people in the room or start that conversation?
Yeah. So it's a really good question. So here I would say it's important then to figure out how can you, one, get the different voices in the room that don't necessarily have to be physically in the room. So what are the ways and processes that you can take to make sure that you're scanning the system for those type of stories? And so, you know, I mentioned appreciative inquiry as a really great methodology, because it helps us go out and really think about what are the different stakeholders. And it really talks about how do we work from our strengths and how do we elevate and augment the strengths that are already happening, the good that's already in the system. So that's important. So think about how do you get the voices in the room? And again, you can do that virtually, you can do that anecdotally as well. So once you have those voices in the room, it's important then that once you're creating those interventions, it should be about how do you, build, have really big thinking, but you build small. So one of the things that's important is that when it's built at a localized level, people have the ability to just integrate their own solution that can work in that space. So instead of saying, this is the process in order to create change, you should be thinking about what are the principles that we want to adhere to that's been co-created from the system, and then how will that manifest itself on the ground? And it might manifest itself very differently. So when we're going through a change process, what you want is then all of these small localized interventions happening in parallel. And then when you find something that's really working, man, you got to highlight it. You have to say, hey, this is working. Talk to us. Not necessarily what did you do, but what process did you follow to get those outcomes? And all of a sudden, people realize, wow, actually, if we can change the way we work, all of a sudden, we can get very different outcomes. And change doesn't become something that people resist. It's something that people will more likely to invite.
That's awesome. So it's all about not just the front end, it's the back end, ensuring that you're telling the story. Somebody said that in one of the breakout rooms, and celebrating the glory. And that way it makes it not so big and scary.
Yep.
Guys, that's fantastic. Thank you so much, Ramon. Before we close off, I'm going to share some links. So first of all, thank you to Ramon for sharing today and for bringing your knowledge. So everyone, if you want to, wherever Ramon is on your screen, maybe you want to high five him towards the edge of the screen. Excellent. All in 4D. Thank you everyone for joining us today. I really appreciate your energy, the conversations. It was good to dip in and out of the breakout rooms and see everyone so proactive, and actually the introductions, that was fantastic. We'd really appreciate if you could give us your feedback today by giving, I'm just popped a survey in the chat. Please just dip into it. It'll take you 2 minutes. It's got a cool GIF animation at the end that I think is pretty rewarding. So it's really invaluable as we continue to build this series, and it's not just about kind of what myself and my team want to learn. If you would like to connect with Ramon and learn more about his company as well as Kaospilot, I've just popped all of the links in the window, and that's the Alkimia Learning, Kaospilot, and Kaospilot have a masterclass coming up in October, as well as Ramon's LinkedIn account. So I'm just going to do that here. That's a gift at the end of the feedback form. Yeah, it's a little bit of a device from us. Okay, so all the links are there. You might see me at one of the programs coming up soon, depending if I can travel. We were discussing that before. If you wish to connect with the ever-growing Future of Now community, please connect with me on LinkedIn. I've just put my link in there now. If you're not part of the Future of Now group on LinkedIn, just connect with me and put Future of Now. You don't have to type me a big introduction, just put hashtag Future of Now. I'll add you, and please be proactive and share things that are going on in your world. To learn more about More Space for Light and get in contact with us and find out what we're doing, I've just popped our links in there. To learn more about the organisations that are connected with this event, both Mural with their templates and tools and what's going on in their world, and it's really worth looking up, especially if you do remote facilitation. I'm about to put their links in the chat, as well as Spaces. Spaces have a great co-working spaces in Melbourne and globally as well. As I know we've got someone from Germany here. I believe they have spaces all across Germany. So hopefully when the lockdown gets opened up and we can go out and start elbow bumping each other, you'll be able to meet there. If you have something to share and would like the opportunity to speak, a few people have already reached out. Please get in touch with us. Here's our email address. and put font in the chat line, in your subject line, and let us know what you'd like to talk about. This is your platform as well. We're trying to build a community here. We will be publishing this session on More Space website next week, and I'll let you know when it's live. All our previous talks on there are live so far. If you just go to our website and click on the Insight button. Our next fortnightly event in the series will be for all those people interested in increasing collaboration and engagement in their remote workshops. We've got an improv queen. We will be joined by someone called Dana Mitrov-Silvers. She is principal and founder of Designing Insights, a San Francisco-based consultancy. It's really exciting. She's got heaps of knowledge. She's got frameworks and cards for improv and design sprints, and you can use them in any types of workshops. They're really cool. Now, due to the wicked time difference of the States, we'll be starting this one at 11 a.m, just in time for your mid-morning snack, hopefully. So that's in a fortnight. We'll be opening the registration over the next few days. So thank you very much, everyone, for being part of today. If you have any other questions about the session or remote work in general, please get in touch with us at More Space for Light. Again, thank you to Ramon. You've been amazing. Thank you for taking us through the ConnectFM framework. Wish everybody a lovely night. Also, for Ramon, happy birthday for tomorrow. It's his birthday tomorrow. So instead of preparing for that, he's joined us and given up his time. So everybody, have a lovely night. Please stay safe. Look after each other. And as always, please stay sane. Thank you, guys. All the best.